else inside if I use this thing. Hey, what's going on YouTube? Yes, I'm still alive. The channel's still right here, right where I left it, so that's always a good thing. It's been a hell of a strange year, I think we can all agree. Firstly, I just want to apologize for the lack of activity on this channel and just my social media in general. Kind of been missing in action, staying pretty low-key in what's been a pretty crazy year. At some point in the summer, there just wasn't too much activity going on with the channel. With the car, things were just kind of getting delayed left, right, and center. It's just a part of the phase that I was currently at. And I just basically logged off the channel. Fast forward a couple of months and I just kind of stayed logged off. But I just remember telling myself that, the next video you're gonna release will be the underside, done and completed. And then, as the months dragged on, it's just becoming more apparent to me that I wouldn't be releasing that video for a while. When I finally logged back in and, wow, seeing all the comments and the new messages on the channel, that was pretty awesome. Thank you all for, all the supportive comments. I'm really sorry it took so long for me to read them and, just get back to you guys. There wasn't a real reason behind it or anything. It was just got out of different habits, got into new ones, so that's pretty much the only reason for that. I just kind of grew out of posting on the channel because I just didn't have anything to post, to be honest. I'm still filming this in 2020. It's probably going to be released sometime in January, so just going to kind of reverse back a little bit and give you a rundown of, kind of how my year went and, give you some updates on the channel. So I'll start back in March. Back in March when everything was kind of just starting to get out of control with the pandemic up here in Ontario. About a week before we went into our first lockdown, my wife ended up slipping on ice and broke her arm while she was out taking her dog for a walk. She actually broke it so bad that she completely fractured and displaced the radius bone in her forearm to the other side. Just underneath her wrist. It was pretty bad, it was pretty serious. She needed surgery and a plate to get it back into place. We were kind of on standby at the hospital for a few days and I just remember waiting around in the hospital, taking in all the crazy coronavirus information, information overload to say the least. It was a weird time being in that hospital. So yeah, wife breaks her arm, coronavirus looming. Everything is basically going into lockdown. Great start to the second quarter of the year. Up here in Ontario, I'm sure like everywhere else, there's just, a lot of craziness going on. A lot of panic buying, huge lineups, businesses closing, shipping delays, inventory shortages, and, just a lot of uncertainty in general. But, we just kept telling ourselves it could really be a lot worse. You just got to be grateful to come out of this year unscathed and, with our health intact, our families, our jobs, everything that's important to us. Fortunately for us is, still intact. So, just really grateful for that. But, like everybody else in March and April, we were just kind of glued to our TVs and our phones, constantly checking, the news, social media, and just seeing how the world was dealing with this pandemic. But honestly, like after the constant cycle and barrage of bad news, it just burned me out, man. I was spending way too much time on my phone on stuff that just wasn't really productive or benefiting my mental state. And cue the stock market. If you're into the stock market, you already know how crazy this year has been. I'm usually a set it and forget it kind of guy, but this year has presented so many great investment opportunities. I just spend a lot of time digesting news, reading, watching, and being way more active than I usually am in trying to optimize some of those opportunities. That's time well spent, in my opinion. There's no doubt that the world events and all the lockdowns definitely wore on us all. I decided to spend my time just doing things that would put me in a better place mentally rather than just allow all the negativity to constantly creep in. But at the same time, I felt like it was a good opportunity to reset, reevaluate things, try to gain some positives out of what is a really shitty situation. I just focused on doing more relaxing stuff, like going out for longer walks with my wife and my dog. Didn't fall on any ice. hanging out in the backyard, reading books, smoking cigars while listening to some good old Alice in Chains and other 90s greatness. Exercising. I managed to build a decent sized home gym downstairs as a result of all the lockdowns and the pandemic. Started taking a few coding courses online this year as a side interest initially, but also to kind of see what could come of it since I've always been intrigued by it. I'm also big on music, so this lockdown really got me back into just playing more and trying to get better because it's something that I really enjoy. It really relaxes me. I play guitar, as you can see behind me. And actually, before the pandemic started, around November 2019, I took up the drums as well. So I've been having fun with both. Like I said, really relaxing, kind of keeps me loose, but also keeps my mind engaged. So it's something that, during all this craziness, you just got to find things that, you can kind of escape to and enjoy. And I might be, that might sound dramatic or whatever, but you feel the way you feel, and that stuff just kind of really helps level me out. So when the pandemic first hit in March, I thought, having a project car would be the perfect way to pass the time in the lockdown. So I just spent a lot of time in March doing little odds and ends on the underside of the car, because the next major thing on my list was to get that underside completely refinished. So there's still some minor welding work to do. I had also cleaned up some of the previous metal work while fixing whatever other imperfections that I had left under there. I had to remove and clean out all the OEM seam sealer. Then it was time to clean, sand, and prep the underside 100% for the final refinish. And man, let me tell you, it was a ton of work. I knew this was going to be a painful process because my OCD was just raging back when I did the engine bay, but this was just a totally different beast. I spent so many hours sanding and cleaning. Between the time spent on the underside and the inside of the car, the hours are easily in the triple digits somewhere, for sure. I mean, I did everything. The wheel wells were old and crusty, so I scraped off all the material from the inside of the wells. The OEM seam sealer was scraped and cleaned out from pretty much every seam underneath the car. It was just so tedious and time consuming to get everything out and perfectly clean. Once you start doing these little things, you kind of micro focus on them. So you spend so much time, making sure that seam is cleaned out perfectly, or, this is sanded perfectly. It's just a really mentally draining and tedious job, for me at least. It took me months to get to the point where I was generally happy with everything and ready to finally apply the first coats of primer. Because the underside of the car is full of crevices and contours, the sanding had to mostly be done by hand with a bit of wire wheel here and there. I was spending weekdays, weekends, just so many hours sanding underneath that thing. It started to really get discouraging because I felt like I had all these hours into it, and yet there was just so much more to do. There was just simply no light at the end of the tunnel, and I realized I'd need to actually sandblast some areas because there were a ton of spots that were just impossible to get to by hand or even by wire wheel that needed to be hit in order to get the surface properly prepped. The problem was also that everything was still locked down at the time because of the virus, and out of all things, I needed a new respirator. In a pandemic with a virus that's airborne, I needed a new respirator to sandblast the car safely, and chances of getting a respirator around that time were pretty much non-existent. I kept searching for a P100 or even a P95, but there was nothing out there. If you know anything about sandblasting, it's just not an option to blast without a respirator. And so because of that delay, I decided to put the sandblasting on hold and start doing other things. I was also planning to get the inside of the car painted at some point, so I decided to start the final prep work myself to keep things kind of moving along. And by the inside, I mean everything. Everything had to be cleaned and sanded for paint, just like I did for the underside. It was a little easier than laying on my back, squirming around and sanding for hours without end, but the work was still tedious and miserable as hell.
Fuck me.
Just as a side note, I was also having a ton of back pain, something I've kind of dealt with for a while now, but this year especially, I was getting pains that would take just like days to subside. I had a major surgery back in 2005, and ever since then I've fought with various levels of chronic pain. This year I ended up getting some x-rays and an ultrasound done because my wife had actually noticed a bump on my lower back. Long story short, I definitely found out that I have some things going on that I definitely wasn't aware of. Even like the surgery I had back in 2005, like it was a pretty intense surgery. I had a metal bar put in my chest, like from one side to the next, and it's still in my chest. I mean, I can get into it another time. It's something that's kind of cool because I do have a huge piece of metal in my body, but I always thought that was the issue. It was kind of like a snowball effect from that surgery, but it's actually like related to my spine and degenerative stuff going on, so it's not fun. Sometime around May, I finally managed to get that damn respirator that I needed, and basically was able to get all of the sandblasting done on the remaining spots that were left on the underside. As you'll see, the sandblasting created an absolute mess, which obviously I fully expected, but still, I was overwhelmed thinking about cleaning it up before I even started to sandblast. It was terrible, but it had to be done. I had no other choice. Just commit, do it all at once, clean it all up in one shot, and then just move on. So that's what I did. So enough rambling for now. I'm gonna throw in some clips here and show some of the progress from this phase. It's super abbreviated and cut way down. It doesn't even begin to show all the work that took place, but it would make for some really boring video, so you'll get the idea. So I had to sandblast this area because there was some surface rust here. Not exactly sure why, but I'm thinking it might have been from the battery or battery acid maybe. Not really sure. It was just in this area here, but it's all good now. Alright, so after all the sandblasting was done, I did a initial cleanup of the garage because the mess, as you saw, was just straight up anxiety provoking. I'm not sure if you saw in the clip, but there was also a really small section of the trunk floor. I ended up cutting out the old piece and had to section out a completely new piece because it was previously damaged. Initially I tried to hammer it out and fix it, then I tried to weld on it and try to make it look better, but it just ended up looking worse. So, you know, it was a little bit of extra work, but it came out great. Now that it's done, it was the right way to go. So after that piece went in, the underside was finally done. That was the last step. Since I was going to paint in the garage as well, I had to make sure the garage was absolutely spotless after all the sandblasting, and that took a really long time. The sand obviously got absolutely everywhere, and I had to clean and go over everything multiple times. The reality is this was an extremely lengthy process for me to get to this point. Between all the sanding work, the sandblasting, the cleaning, it was a ton of hours. Alright, so while I was working on the underside, I ordered primer, seam sealer, undercoating, and a bunch of other supplies. This was around the time that everything was either curbside pickup or just reopening again. Literally everything was out of stock. I didn't know when or if they would carry the stuff that I was specifically looking for. So because I ordered everything online and out of province, I kind of expected everything to be a little delayed, but I figured if I ordered early enough that, it wouldn't be too much of a problem. And at least I would get, the exact products that I wanted to use on the car. Long story short, my orders ended up taking about 4 weeks to arrive, only to find half of my order missing from the delivery, and only half of it showed up. There's just like one thing after another. Delays were obviously not ideal, but at the end of the day, I was just happy I was able to get the exact products that I wanted to use. Just because for a time there, I just didn't think it was going to happen. Another thing I was struggling with was how I was going to paint underneath the car. The underside has a lot of surface area to cover, and my smallish compressor wasn't going to be able to keep up without running constantly. So I started looking into turbine spray systems. After a bit of research, they sounded really promising, and I figured it would be perfect for this application and future projects down the road. So I ended up getting a 4-stage turbine spray system. They're actually pretty awesome. They run completely tankless, they run on 120 volts, and they're super compact. So I managed to order one online, but again, after 2 weeks of waiting for the tracking number, they email me and they tell me that it's back ordered. So I'd be getting refunded immediately, and then I'd have to try to hunt down another supplier. So after all of that, it was basically time to get the garage 100% ready and set up. I gave it a real thorough and lengthy cleaning again. I built a makeshift ventilation system, and then it was time to give the underside multiple wipe downs with a wax and grease remover before finally laying the 2 coats of epoxy primer. So I ended up using SPI's solvent-based degreaser, and then followed it up with the SPI waterborne degreaser. So after doing multiple passes with the solvent degreaser, and then once the rags were completely spotless, I would then move on to the waterborne degreaser, which picked up even more stuff that the solvent degreaser didn't. Again, doing multiple passes until the rags were absolutely spotless, and that was for the entire underside. After that, it was ready to go for the epoxy primer. So the epoxy came out great. Painting conditions in a home garage are not ideal. Even with the car up pretty high on the jack stands there, it's just not a lot of space to move around before you start bumping into things. On top of that, paint guns aren't really designed to be held up completely like horizontal, so I had to get into some really awkward positions to get full coverage without tilting the gun up too high. Had it been on a lift or a rotisserie, I think painting would have gone a lot easier, a lot smoother, but at that point it wasn't really an option for me, so again, you gotta work with what you've got. Having said that though, everything worked out just fine. The epoxy looks great. The turbine system sprayed great with minimal overspray. I ended up spraying the lens a little bit, so it may have looked a little hazy with overspray in certain clips, but it was actual paint on the cellophane wrap protecting my camera lens. My plan after the 2 initial coats of epoxy was to go back and do all of the seam sealer everywhere, underneath and in the wheel wells and pretty much everything. And then go back and do another 2 coats of epoxy. I ended up using the Evercoat 2K epoxy seam sealer. The stuff is much better than any 1K urethane seam sealer, but it's just a total pain in the ass to work with because it cures super quick. So if you don't move fast enough, the nozzles will get locked up on you, and you got to keep changing out the nozzles. So for that reason, I ended up ordering just a bunch of spare nozzles so I wouldn't have to worry about seizing up or running out and then kind of being stuck and out of luck, right? The recoat window of the epoxy primer that I used is actually 7 days without having to resand, unlike some of the other brands. So it gave me enough time to seam seal and prep for that final epoxy coating. It was still recommended to scuff up all the seamed areas for the seam sealer. So I scuffed up all the seams again, had to clean with degreaser again, and then apply the sealer. But because there were a lot of seams to do underneath the car, it put me well outside of the 4-hour top coat window on the seam sealer. So guess what? I had to scuff up all the seams I just did again, re-clean them with degreaser again, and do that basically until everything was spotless so it could be top coated with the final epoxy primer coat. So if you look closely there, you'll see that I masked off some of the spots on the subframe connectors with tape because the Stifler's web bracing that I have still needed to be welded in at the time. I chose to paint first before welding them in because it's just really hard to get access and full coverage in certain spots under there. Doing it this way definitely created a lot of extra steps in the process with like masking stuff off, extra cleaning, having to weld and then clean the welds and then, prep and grind the welds so the paint sticks. All that kind of stuff is extra work when you could have done it in one shot. In my mind, this was like the only way I would be able to do a clean paint job underneath the car without, getting runs, missing spots, missing tight areas where you can't quite get the gun up because the braces are blocking you, right? All in all, I am extremely happy with the results. It looks brand new under there. The epoxy is super resilient and it should preserve the underside for a very, very long time. I will admit the gray looked cool as hell, but at this point in time, I had kind of everything already mapped out and ready to go for the final undercoating, which I will say at this point is actually finished and completed. And it came out fantastic. I'm super happy with the results. Probably done way too much talking, but then again, I owe you guys about a year's worth of talking since I've been missing in action, so I guess it all evens out. I'll probably put the next stage of painting and the undercoating and stuff in the next video. Definitely wish I could have kept up with more frequent videos and just the channel in general, but in terms of the car, this was a really tedious and time-consuming phase. Paint and prep is just super labor-intensive, and a majority of my year with the car was basically just that. And with the shutdowns, it just created a lot of delays. The powder coater that I use lost some of my suspension components, like my lower control arms for my rear end. Yeah, that happened too this year. But yeah, I'll get into that and a bunch of other stuff, another time. This year, I don't know. Constantly sanding the car with no end in sight, inside and underside. It just really took the fun out of working on the car for a while there. I don't even know how many times I questioned my life decisions while I was underneath that car sanding for hours. Obviously making progress on the car, love working on the car. It's all stuff that I'm, extremely grateful for. especially when I know so many people out there are struggling. Again, I just want to thank all of you for watching the videos, for dropping amazingly supportive comments and messages, and just for all the support in general. It is, it's much appreciated. So with that being said, I just want to wish all of you a happy new year, good riddance to 2020. Let's hope 2021 gets us back to some sort of normalcy, but more importantly, enables us to get out there and experience the world the way it was meant to be experienced, with the people that are most important to us. So I'll leave it there. I'll see you on the next one.